Khansa.
Yes, we're live.
So the floor is yours, and yeah, I'll start sharing once you the slides once you start with the session.
Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. We're excited to have you here with us, joining us today for this wonderful discussion, which celebrates the legacy of Martin Luther King and also the Black History Month. We have here with us professors, we have here with us student activists, and we are excited to have you, and we are happy to hear from you, hear your questions, listen to your thoughts, so engage with us and celebrate this month with us, question these amazing experts with us, and we hope that you learn and that you have a good time with us. Before we move any further, we have here with us Mr. Michael Pointer from the US Embassy in Doha's Public Affairs section. Over to you,
Mike. Thank you, Khansa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to join Khansa, our panelists, and everyone in our virtual audience today to discuss the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King dedicated his life to the nonviolent struggle for racial equality in the United States. Each January, Americans mark Martin Luther King Day as a US holiday that honors Dr. King's legacy and challenges Americans to engage in volunteer service in honor of his commitment to improving the lives of others. During the 1963 March on Washington, D.C., Dr. King declared that all people should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. More than 50 years after his assassination, many still continue to act upon the global meaning of Dr. King's statement that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We know that the promise of the United States is that every American has an equal chance to get ahead, yet persistent systemic racism and barriers to opportunity have denied this promise for so many. To address these shortcomings, President Biden is putting equity at the center of our agenda with a whole of government approach to embed racial justice across federal agencies, policies, and programs. During today's panel, I encourage a vibrant exchange of ideas about how Americans, Qataris, and citizens of the world at large can come together to fully achieve the goals of Dr. King and the American Civil Rights Movement. And if any of you are ever in Washington, D.C., I encourage you to visit the National Memorial to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., located near the Lincoln Memorial, where he delivered his inspiring "I Have a Dream" speech. Thank you, and I wish you success in a robust dialogue today and continued engagement in the future. Over to you, Khansa.
Thank you so much. So before we talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream and our own dream for an equal future, let's introduce to you our amazing lineup of panelists today. We have here with us Professor Charles W. McKinney, who is not only a chair of the Africana Studies program, but also an associate professor of history at Rhodes College. Our second panelist for today is Dr. Mark Lance, who is a philosophy professor and also teaches Justice and Peace Studies, and also is co-director of the Justice and Peace Studies, co-chair of the Justice and Peace Studies program in Georgetown University. Our third panelist for today is Iman Ismail, who is a student activist in Doha and focuses on not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but also religious inclusivity and just women rights activism. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for coming here today, for joining us for this conversation, and for talking to us about someone whose name we all know, but perhaps need a refresher on his mission and his vision and the impact that he's had in shaping the civil rights movement not just in the United States, but also globally. So before we sort of dive into this conversation, let's just understand where these activists are coming from, what made them delve into these social justice movements, where their journey sort of started, and where their journey is at today. So Dr. McKinney, would you like to begin by sort of walking us through your journey, how you began to research into this, and how you're contributing to this today?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to a spirited conversation with my fellow panelists. So my journey to sort of where I am now began in college. As fate would have it, I attended Morehouse College, the same college as Dr. King down in Atlanta. And that's where I was really exposed to a lot of both national and global struggles for liberation. So I was in college. The movement for liberation was really heating up in South Africa, for instance. There had always been an occurrence of police, several occurrences of police brutality, right? You know, I was in school in the late 80s. So, and was in graduate school when the Rodney King incident in Los Angeles happened, where a black man was caught on video. A black man was being literally beaten by 6 or 7 cops, none of whom were accused of a crime, which led to major riots in South Central Los Angeles. And so that was a moment in time where I started to see some really explicit connections between my studies of Martin King and why he was engaged in the struggle that he was engaged in, and actually seeing the reasons why, the reasons why he was engaged in those struggles, right? So I became a historian. I wanted to know and I wanted to understand why we had a civil rights movement, why a Black freedom struggle exists. And then I also became, I was never too far away from the action in terms of either giving aid and comfort to activists or sometimes stepping out into the streets myself. So I try to blend, I try to wear those two hats. But primarily I'm a teacher. Primarily I'm a scholar of the Black freedom struggle. So I want people to understand the systems and structures that they are actually battling against, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for describing your journey for us. I think it's really powerful when you talk about dismantling these systems, but also doing it by understanding where we sort of came from and also why we want to dismantle them to begin with, rather than just sort of jumping on the bandwagon, so to say. Professor Mark Lance, you focus on a program, which is the Justice and Peace Studies program, which sort of focuses on dismantling these systems, talking about building a constructive movement that has a lasting impact. So can you tell us a little about your journey and how you ended up here today?
Sure. Thank you so much for this and for putting this together. Similar to Professor McKinney, I think it all started in college. And for me, it was some people challenging me that I was rather ignorant about the institutions of my own society. And I took that seriously enough to go do some study and decided that much of the privilege and opportunities in my life were in fact built on institutions that systematically harmed and disempowered other people. And to me, that just straightforwardly implied that I had to do work to change all of that. So I've been involved in movement work for almost 40 years around an enormous range of issues. I had some early amazing mentors like Molly Rush, and who was an extremely important anti-war organizer, Dennis Brutus, the South African poet, who I worked with on South African apartheid at the University of Pittsburgh when I was a grad student. And I've kept at it since then. As you say, it's come into my academic work through the Justice and Peace Studies program, where we try to both teach people about theoretical underpinnings of issues of justice and peace, but also teach people the skills needed to do this work effectively.
So both of you described that your journey started in college. That's when you realized there was a problem and you wanted to address it, and you found your own way to address it. So let's hear from a student who is in college and is trying to address it in her own way, and is trying to solve the problems that we see by not just her student activism, but also in the academic work that she does. So Iman, we'd like to hear from you about your journey.
Thank you, Khansa, and thank you to the U.S. Embassy in Doha for inviting me. First off, I would like to say that as a student and not an educator here, I do feel highly underqualified and quite daunted for the task before me, but I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope that there's something that I can contribute to this platform. And Khansa, with regards to your question, I think for me, the activism did not necessarily start in high school. Or rather in college, but perhaps maybe in high school. And in realizing, becoming more conscientious of the environment that I'm in, because I was raised, though I was born in the US, I was raised in the Philippines. And being in a society that is fundamentally different from my own, which is very hard and difficult to relate to, you don't necessarily experience direct racism, but you do experience what it means to be different and to be ostracized in a community. And for me, a lot of this stemmed from a social activism rooted in religious knowledge. I think in many ways I relate to Dr. Martin Luther King on this subject, is the recognition that my religion and my activism are not substitutes, but rather companions on this in sort of the journey that we take in establishing social justice. And having lived and traveled in several different places, you start to realize that it becomes a norm for myself to measure how comfortable I am in a place by how long it takes me to remember I'm Black, either because of side stares or glares or attitudes or outright ostracization. And you realize I have the comfort and the privilege of being in areas where that isn't an issue, being from Sudan and being from a Black country. But for individuals who are in a society which is constantly continue to ostracize them, it's not necessarily the case. And in my religion, there is a fundamental goal, perhaps one could call it the golden rule, is to enjoin good and forbid evil. And that goes for all communities. It's never to single out, it's never to be selective with your activism. And so I think as a student, so to speak, of those systems and structures which were mentioned by Dr. McKinley, I'm attempting not to impose, but rather to incorporate and borrow these lessons that we've learned from the United States stage of activism in order to understand how can we dismantle racism wherever it exists.
Thank you so much for joining us and for describing your journey. And I mean, before we talk about the systems we need to dismantle and how far we've come, for our audience here and for me, because I'd like to learn more about it, Dr. McKinney, if you could describe why the legacy of Martin Luther King is significant to begin with, that'd be amazing.
Sure. So really briefly, one of the things that I think is really important for us when we understand King is we have to understand the lengths we have gone in this country to misinterpret what King tried to tell us, right? We have gone to great lengths in this nation and around the world, but particularly here in the United States, to defang and declaw Martin Luther King. The version that we learn about, that most of my students learn about, I call it the Black Santa Claus version of Martin King, right? And so that's the first thing we have to understand. So let me give you a quick example of that. At the new King Memorial created up in Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful structure, a wonderful sculpture. And there are 14 quotes, Martin King quotes, inscribed all around that structure, all around that statue. The words segregation, racial inequality, and racism are not in any of those quotes. Right? I want you to just wrap your mind around that for a moment. Right? That of the 14 quotes, there's not a single reference to the legal racial operating system that Martin King was dedicating his life to fighting against, right? I mean, it's literally like going to a Holocaust memorial and there's no reference to the Holocaust, right? I mean, that's the level of, so what I'm trying to suggest here is that we've done a really good job at disconnecting King from what King was actually doing, right? Disconnecting King from the battles that King actually waged, right? So King, the King that we celebrate in the United States is the King of turn the other cheek and be nonviolent, the King of, community service, the King of faint and vague references to systemic inequality, but not the King, right? That was a fierce opponent, was a fierce critic of white supremacy, was a fierce critic of segregation in particular, not the King that said the three great evils of humankind are racism, militarism, and poverty, right? And you don't fight racism, militarism, and poverty by just singing spirituals, right? You don't fight those three things by painting houses. You don't fight those three things by ignoring the genesis of those, by ignoring the systems and structures responsible for perpetuating those things, right? You have to understand what those systems and structures are. And then, and only then King shows us and instructs us. Then and only then can you actually battle against them, right? So Martin Luther King writes a letter from a Birmingham jail. It is not the letter from the Birmingham Country Club. It is not the letter from the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce. He is in jail. And the reason he is in jail is because he has gone to confront the structure, the system known as segregation in Birmingham, which was one of the most violent cities in America, nicknamed Bombingham because of the racial terrorism that was routinely perpetrated against Black people, activists and non-activists alike. You could get your house blown up if you moved into a white neighborhood. You could get your business blown up if you were Black and successful, right? So so those marches and those protests and those boycotts, they were for something, right? They were designed to confront the system of segregation, which had barred Black people from stopped them from moving into the mainstream of American life, right? So again, King is instructive. We just have to go out and find the real King, right? I tend to ask my students to, instead of focusing on the last 45 seconds of the I Have a Dream speech, I'll make this point really quickly and then shut up. The last 45 seconds of the Martin King speech, free at last, content of our character, color of our skin, focus on the first part, right? Where the first part, he says, you know what, we're still suffering from police brutality. We're still suffering from racial violence. In the American South, Black people are not allowed to vote outside of the South. They have nothing to vote for, right? In the first half of the I Have a Dream speech, he says, we are engaged in a massive protest, massive struggles, and we're not going home. We're not stopping until we get our rights. So if there's lots and lots of people out in the streets right now, good. We're trying to bring more people out into the streets right now because we see the levels of resistance that we are facing on the federal level, on the state level, and the local level when it comes to the pursuit of greater freedom. So that's one of the most fundamental lessons of King, right? King had a systemic analysis, right, in terms of where the battle should be waged.
I think it's really significant what you just pointed out, because we talk about these names and they've almost become synonymous with activism, with community, with values, and with basically being good and being activisty or woke in that sense. And I really do appreciate how you highlighted the fact that there's a lot more to this dream than just I have a dream. So sort of thank you for bringing us back to where it all started from and how much we still need to do. Dr. Marklans, where do you think the legacy of Martin Luther King has impacted the United States and also globally? What do you think the impact has been as of yet? We know where it hasn't been, but where has it been impactful?
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to thank Dr. McKinney for those remarks. Yeah, it's easy to forget that King was murdered at a labor march, that he described the United States as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He did indeed have a systemic analysis, and also that his nonviolence was not turning the other cheek and singing spirituals. It was about obstructing the operation of oppressive systems. It was about finding ways without using the master's tools to stop the master's oppression. But before we go on, I do want to, Dr. McKinney spoke of connections, and I want to emphasize another dimension of that I think is really important. We're talking about the legacy of Dr. King, but no individual builds a movement. No individual has a legacy on his own. And what I want to just emphasize for a second here is that our talk about the civil rights movement should be every bit as much about people like Bayard Rustin and Mandy Carter, two core organizers, theorists for decades who were in the background because of their sexuality, or people like Esau Jenkins and Septima Clark, who built the Sea Island and later the Highlander movements, schools movements, the great Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham. My dear friend Zahara Simmons, who was a teenage organizer who, at the time, who set up networks in Black churches among the women's committees to provide the space, the material, and the resources for all of this organizing to happen. And I'm saying this not just because we don't want to leave out other names of people who deserve credit, but the same institutions that denounced and surveilled and infiltrated King's organizations in his lifetime now have a tendency to deify him and to make this entire movement be about this one magic person. And the message that sends to people now, to people like Iman, is that, well, if you can't be like King, if you can't be a famous preacher and a great rhetorician and a brilliant theorist, you can't really do anything, and you have to just wait for the next Messiah. And the reality is that all of us have a role in these movements. All of us have contributions to play. And the last thing we should be trying to do is disempower people by hiding the contributions of millions of ordinary folks. So that's my contrarian comment. In terms of the your specific question, look, I mean, I would never underplay the importance of defeating legal segregation, right? The United States at the time, it was illegal for Dr. McKinney and I to ride on buses together, or to use the same drinking fountain, or to appear in all sorts of places together. This panel would never have occurred in most of the United States prior to the movement that Dr. King was a part of. That's important. That's crucial. At the same time, right, Black family median income in the United States is 15% of white family median income in the United States. Almost all of our major institutions are de facto segregated by a complex array of social and political forces. We've got a mass African-American population in prison and thereby disenfranchised and economically harmed for the rest of their lives. So many of these structures of the broader things Dr. King was talking about have not been changed. And this is not just in the United States either, I should emphasize. One can look at the structure of countries all over the world and see similar structures. And of course, Dr. King was an internationalist, first and foremost and always. And so these are ongoing struggles. And to my mind, some of the strategic and tactical ideas that Dr. King gave us, which are much more complicated than the caricature that's usually put out, that he was the nice, nonviolent guy and people like Malcolm were the evil, bad, violent people. These people worked together from the beginning, right? The Southern Christian Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Southern Christian Leadership Committee worked together with the Deacons of Defense in planning events throughout the South. We need to become much more sophisticated in both paying attention to what Dr. King said in learning the lessons of the tactics for change and in understanding how very much of our society needs to be transformed if we're going to create a beloved community of the sort that he envisioned.
Absolutely. So the idea isn't just to read about Martin Luther King, to read about these speeches. It's to understand how we can change the systems and where they need to be changed to begin with, rather than just talking about the legacy. It's about applying the impact of that legacy in our lives.
Absolutely.
And you spoke a little about the global impact that he's had in terms of, him being an internationalist. And so let's hear from Iman, because she's lived in various countries: Sudan, Philippines, Doha. How many more, I don't remember. But Iman, can you tell us a little about how you understand the global implications of Martin Luther King and his impact?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And before I jump into that, I want to take it back a little bit to talk about the erasure that was mentioned by both of the professors before us, because it reminds me of an interview with Harry Belafonte, a singer and activist who was vital to the civil rights movement. And in that interview, he said that in order to kill a movement, you must kill off the thinkers behind that movement. And that's what they did, or at least that's what they tried to do. And in one fell swoop, they killed Medgar Evers, they killed Malcolm X, they killed Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy, and then Martin Luther King, of course. But what I realized, this is not quite entirely true, is that though they did kill the individuals behind the movement, the thinkers behind the movement, they did not kill the movement itself, but rather I think they allowed for the erasure and cleansing of that movement, for the dialogue that they wanted to spill through to eventually spill through to the public. And what that has led to is for the international community to realize it in the same lens, is that only now in my college years have I started to realize that the civil rights movement was not quite as crisp and clean as we were taught that it was, and that there's so much fundamentally behind it that we were not taught about. And I think from what I'm hearing, it's not only the case internationally, but this is the case even within the local American context. But also what you realize is that in the movements that came after and were born of the civil rights movement, headed, of course, by Martin Luther King, what we recognize is that not only were these movements born of the civil rights, but these were the ones leading these movements and those rallies and protests were, in one way or another, the adopted children of Martin Luther King Jr. And I would even go so far as to say of the community that existed behind him, as was already elaborated by these professors. And what happened so on is that you see these movements spill out into the international context. And I think that was very, very clear, especially internationally, just last year in 2020. With the uprisings in the Black Lives Matter movement, and how internationally people were attempting to apply the Black Lives Matter context to their own countries. And I can speak with regards to the Kenyan context and with regards to the Qatari context. But what you often realize, that sort of the mistake there, is that you cannot simply take these ideas and impose them upon a society, is that you have to incorporate them in a way that fits that social local context, which is often the failing, because racial issues exist internationally. And the legacy of Martin Luther King exists internationally as well. And we have to take this and realize what parts of it truly can we recognize in our own social context, as opposed to enforcing the values that don't necessarily work in our own context and what we're trying to solve in these societies and communities. Because racism does, as I said, it exists everywhere, but it exists everywhere in different forms. And another thing is what is, I think, what we learn a lot from in the story of Martin Luther King and in the civil rights movement that existed behind him, not only with him, but the communities and the people that we don't hear about so often, is the story of humanity and humanness. And by that, I don't only mean sort of the fight for social justice and inclusion, but, well, of course, that was important, but is a recognition of the imperfections of these individuals and the imperfections of the society that they existed in. Is because that's what helps us understand that they were human, they made mistakes. And for students like myself, that's important. We need to see that. We need to see that you don't need to be a perfect social activist in order to instill perfect social change. Is that you can be imperfect in your own sense, but find the communities that work with you and will work for you, and ensure that you are pursuing a struggle resiliently. I think that's what was most important about the civil rights movement, is that it was a resilience that existed behind the individuals who worked so hard to ensure that it went forth. And remembering from these stories that we don't, even though as students and as student activists, we might not necessarily have found our voices and our platform, but the realization that our imperfections will not be our hindrance as long as we do not let them be.
I mean, as a student, I think what you're talking about is absolutely necessary for all of us to hear, because it's about listening to, you know, your inner voice that tells you that there is something which is wrong, which needs to be, you know, challenged, which you need to fight against in terms of bringing systemic change. But a lot of times when we try to fight these systems, we do encounter certain barriers, and we do realize that we don't really have a lot of freedom of speech. And this isn't targeted to a particular area, it's in general. So can you, Dr. McKinney, talk to us about the role of freedom of speech in structuring these social justice movements and creating these sort of communities which can fight against these sort of systemic problems? And what role does freedom of speech play in structuring civil society in the United States?
Well, that's a great question, but I did want to circle back really quickly and talk just really briefly about one of the things that has been erased from the 1950s and 1960s, right, is the role that students play, right, in all of this, in all of this, right? Students are in the political and intellectual vanguard of the civil rights movement, right? You know, we remember February 1, 1960 as the moment where 4 undergraduates, right, essentially kick off the sit-in movement, right? We remember that the freedom rides are spearheaded by a bunch of 20-year-olds, right? We remember that, you know, it's really important for us to remember that, again, students, right? Not professors, right? Not history and philosophy professors, but students, undergraduates, people undergraduate age, college age people, right, are in the vanguard of this movement. So, and so that's one of the things that that's really important for us to remember. And, you know, in the 1960s, when students were out conducting themselves in the movement, right, adults were like, oh, well, this is crazy. Go back and study, go back and read. Why are you out in the streets? Why are you engaged in these particular sorts of activities? Let the adults handle it. Right, to which the students responded, we let you handle it, and that's why we're here. Right, we let the 50-year-olds have a crack at it, right? The adults, you all are the ones that drove us into the ditch. So now we are going to try to take some moves. Now we're going to try to make some moves to get us out of the ditch, right? So students are a critical, and you can make the argument students are central. They're central movers when it comes to moments of struggle and moments of liberation. And so one of the things that students are also doing, right, is that they're testing these boundaries, right? They're seeing whether or not the United States, for instance, in particular, is actually going to support the principles and the principles that they say they espouse, right? So yes, freedom of speech. Okay, here is our speech. Right? Here is our rhetoric. Here is our talk. It's a language of liberation. It is a language of equality. It is a language of disruption. Now, right? Y'all, hey, local sheriff's office, there was a Klan rally, right, in our county, right down the street, and you all just sort of sat around while the Klan burned, a cross and and espouse their terroristic, right, their terroristic ethos. And you said that was freedom of speech. Okay, well, we're gonna have a march downtown, right? And we're gonna have a rally standing against that. We're also gonna have a rally critiquing the systems and structures of the country. So we have every expectation, right, that the freedom of speech that you allow other folks to exercise, we also will be allowed to exercise. Right. So again, students are in the vanguard of testing of kicking the tires, right, of testing the limits, of testing the mettle of the nation when it comes to these ideas and concepts around freedom of speech. And again, young people are also in the vanguard in terms of creating communities and creating these pockets of possibility with regard to this free expression. And so, one of the things that we have to wade through now, right, is this concept of cancel culture, right? Which is kind of like as a myth, right? I mean, there's a phrase, that the old folks, a kicked dog will holler, right? And so what that means is, when people stand up and say, hey, you know what, this was kind of racist or transphobic or homophobic, right? This is really problematic speech and I'm calling you out on it, right? And then all of a sudden, oh, cancel culture, right? Oh, this is deleterious. This is bad for society. No. It's bad for a population of society that wants to maintain and sustain, right? And sanction certain types of speech designed to subordinate, right? Designed to oppress people, right? Designed to keep people in subordinate places and spaces, right? So when Muslim women, for instance, stand up and say, we demand to be heard on a particular set of issues, right? That's them. They're not engaged in constitutionally, right? They're not engaged in sort of some sort of extraordinary act. That act is rendered extraordinary because of the context of Islamophobia, right? Because of the context of patriarchy, right? Because of the context of, look, you know what? We've structured our society where certain people should have the right to free speech, but certain other people should not, right? And so students, again, are central characters in testing the boundaries and asking our political leaders, right? And also people in the press, hey, do you really believe these ideas? Right? Do you really believe in the free expression and exchange of ideas? We're going to put that to the test, and we're also going to watch you if your inconsistency remains as consistent as it has been in previous generations.
So clearly, there's a lot more to freedom of speech than just having laws that allow you the freedom of speech and that allow you to say whatever it is that you want to say. There's a lot to do with listening to those ideas, to embracing what they suggest, and then making our societies evolve positively on the basis of that. And clearly, students like Iman and me have a lot to do with it. So Iman, I wanted to hear from you about your perspective of the evolution of the freedom of speech with reference to the civil rights movement in the United States and also globally.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I'm not quite well equipped to talk about the evolution of freedom of speech within the United States context, besides what I know from personal experience, and the experience of family members who live there. But I think what is interesting to me and what I'm a little more familiar with is that existence internationally, or at least in the communities where I've existed. And you realize that freedom of speech is essentially the same everywhere. It's simply people wanting to have a platform for their voices to be heard and being allowed to say whatever they feel needs to be said, but also learning to draw that fine line between the freedom of speech and hate speech. When does which is clearly a very blurred line, which is clearly a very hard conversation to have, because you have to understand, well, when do we stop an individual from using freedom of speech, from utilizing it at the expense of others? And I think what's interesting for me is that freedom of speech has helped us redefine the way we communicate. Is that in the communities, especially, I'll use it again, 2020 as an example, when the Black Lives Matter movement essentially spilled into Qatar. And you have people who are saying we can no longer talk about racism as if it exists in a different context. We have to talk about racism as it exists in the MENA context, in the Middle East and North African context, where it's very prevalent, where it is definitely the case where you have individuals who are ostracized from communities for having a darker skin tone or being preferred because of a lighter skin tone. And that is colorism, of course, and how it exists so deeply entrenched in society, and trying to finally open that mold and say, we're going to have discussions about this. We're going to finally discuss the hard topics that our culture refuses to address because they assume it's taboo. And it's that recognition of what does it mean for something to have been defined as taboo, and often, how do you justify something as being defined as taboo? And I know personally, religion is often used as that justification, is that this is part of conservatism and modesty. We can't have this discussion. But religion does not hinder you from having discussions about tough topics. it tells you how to orient those discussions in a respectful manner, as opposed to using those discussions to harm or hurt others. And that's what essentially freedom of speech is realizing we can have these conversations and we can develop society in a peaceful manner without having to hurt one another's feelings, because we understand what respect is, and we understand how respect exists fundamentally as a human right. And that we don't have to use or take advantage of our religious traditions or cultural traditions or whatever it may be to justify our inability to reconcile our differences, but instead using those platforms as an opportunity to reconcile those differences.
Iman, what you said is so important, because really these issues aren't just about a place or a religion or a particular group of people. They're universal. And I guess freedom of speech is also universal in the sense that it is obviously needed to sort of talk about these issues, present solutions, discuss solutions, and then hopefully somehow come up with something that works and is also accepted by our pluralist societies. Let's hear from Dr. Mark Lance about the implications of freedom of speech on the civil rights movement and its development in the United States.
Sure. Let me add one point to this. Speech is only valuable insofar as it's given uptake, right? The point of speech is to communicate. The point of communication is to make us think and guide our actions based on that thought. So I'll give you an example. Nobody is going to say a word or do anything to me. Some people will say words, but no one is going to do anything to me if I talk to a group of people about the structures of apartheid in Israel. But if I work with people to organize a boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, to put actual pressure on conditions that are dispossessing millions of people, that's where we start stepping in, and we start passing laws, and we start labeling this as if this is somehow an unacceptable behavior. And the point is, I can talk all I want as long as no one in power listens, and they carry on with their violence, whatever it is, whether it's a war or racism or whatever. But to actually matter, the people who are speaking have to have an actual role in the power structures of our society. And just as the elimination of legal segregation didn't eliminate white supremacy, the elimination of legal restrictions on what words I can say don't provide for a meaningful sense of free speech. That comes with the building of genuine institutions of democracy, and we only achieve that through the kind of organizing and action and disruption that King was calling for if we're in the midst of a society where power is reserved to a few people. Right now, we're watching these impeachment trials, right? One side is making arguments, is appealing to both emotion and reason and law, and the other side is smiling and politely watching, and then are going to vote the same way they were going to vote from the very beginning. And we all know that. That's not communication. That's not a sharing of ideas. That's not even a debate. It's just raw exercise of power. And you see that all over the world on a huge range of issues. And that's why speech, the fight for free speech is the fight for political power.
Let's talk a little about how this fight for free speech and the fight for political power has evolved in the United States. So if Dr. McKinney, if you could explain to us sort of, and I know this is long and can't just be explained in maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but if you could sort of take us through the struggle of civil rights in the United States and its progression.
Wow, yeah, how much time do you have? So I think that we can think of the civil rights movement, we can think of that, you can think of that as sort of peeling back layers of an onion, right? And so if we start in the 1950s, which is always sort of fraught, right? You start with a period where there's a contingent of the civil rights community that is saying, okay, look, you know, it's really important for us to, for instance, get legal segregation dismantled, right? You know, there's a contingent of the community that says, look, you know what, this movement has to be, this battle has to be waged in the state houses, right? We have to get particular court cases overturned. We have to get particular sets of laws rendered unconstitutional, right? So Brown v. Board. We have to get a Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We have to, you know, we have to amend the laws of the nation, right? So then we amend the law. So you know, so we start the process of amending the laws of the nation, and there's massive pushback about that, right? Some of these laws, right? Some laws are passed, court rulings are decided, and we see the ebb and flow of the ebb and flow of the legal realities of civil rights. A lot of the gains in that area are dialed back, right? You know, the white backlash that we see starting in the 1970s and sort of culminating in a lot of ways in the 1980s. We see a dismantling of a lot of civil rights legislation, right? And so the other thing that's going on at that moment, right, is the realization, and this realization is articulated by Black power activists and by others, that look, you know, one of the things that we should have learned in this moment, right, was the reality of institutional and structural racism, right? So as we peel back layers, right, we see more layers, right? And so then people start to sharpen the analysis and saying, look, you know what, it's not enough to simply pass laws. It's not enough to simply bring people into proximity with each other, right? You don't fix educational inequality by simply desegregating schools, for instance, right? If communities are under-resourced because of the realities of housing segregation, because of the realities of redlining, right? Then, you know, bringing people into community with each other, that's just barely going to put a dent in the problem, right? So then the other thing that goes on is we start to see the totality of the impact of systemic and institutional racism, right? So it's not just about school buildings and water faucets, right? It's about where people live. It's about, one of the things I have to remind my students of, right, is racial inequality impacts you from the moment of your birth, because your birth is impacted by the reality of race, to the moment when you die, right? And when you die, you will probably be buried in a community of where all the other dead people around you look just like you, right? And so every moment in between that, right, is shadowed by the reality of race. So schools, houses, homes, access to healthcare, right? Mass incarceration, right? And environmental racism, right? So not to paint too bleak a picture here, but one of the things that needs to happen, right? That needed to happen was that people in the movement, and King is also really instructive here, right? When we dial into King, everyone likes to talk about King circa 63, right? You know, I have a dream, ha, 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 right? But folks are, you know, but you don't see a whole lot of people quoting from his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, where he's talking about white backlash, where he's talking about the billions of dollars that will need to be expended by the federal government across all sectors, housing, education, right? To battle rising rates of incarceration, right? We don't talk about that King who says, look, you know what? I'm not excited about the possibility of putting a man on the moon when there are millions of people living and dying in poverty in the country, right? We're not excited about that King, right? So again, so we can see the evolution of the movement, right? As a perpetual sort of revealing of the systems and structures that are responsible for and that facilitate and maintain, right? A white supremacist, you know, that maintain a white supremacist infrastructure, right? That maintain racial subordination. And then we're also seeing a process where more and more people, you know, the ebb and flow of people coming into that process, trying to figure out, how do I fight this, right? Which is a huge question, right? Students, you like, how do I, you know, it's like trying to punch a hole in the sky. W.E.B. Du Bois is really articulate about this in his Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He's like, I am trying to describe a system, an operating system that is sanctified, that is sanctioned on every, you know, every branch of the government, right? It's the water that I swim in. How do I describe this to you, right? And so we're perpetually in that moment as well. How do I fight mass incarceration, right? How do I fight militarism? Right? How do I fight these things that King and others had articulated back in the 1960s? And so that's also this process of becoming, this process of becoming aware of these issues and figuring out where you plug in. That is also sort of a perpetual process, right? That's a process that, you know, from my end, and I'll go ahead and speak for Professor Lance too. You know, we would love to see more people engaged in. Right? We would love to see more people sort of involved in, to sort of jump in with both feet, not just on the weekends, right? But with both feet. So the evolution of the movement. Last thought, right? The evolution of the movement is the bringing in of people, is getting people sort of to realize, right, the totality of the issues, and then people realizing and trying to figure out where they can plug in to effectuate, to do their small part, right, in effectuating fundamental systemic change. And so it's an ebb and flow. It's an ongoing process, and we're always in the middle of it, right? We're always in the middle of it.
Thank you. So clearly, like, there are a lot of complexities to the movement, and it doesn't end here. Like, there is a lot of onus on us to take it further, to understand it further, and to leave our impact on the movement rather than just talking about it. Professor Mark Lance, could you talk to us a little about the successes of the movement in the United States?
About successes. Well, look, I mean, the movement, to my mind, you know, shouldn't be pulled out as something that happened in 10 years in the 1960s, right? The founding of this country started with two great crimes, slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples. But there was resistance to both of these as soon as the crimes began. There were people standing with these communities. There were people who gave their lives to fighting against against these crimes. And, you know, so you need to look at, you know, if we're looking historically, and I'm sure Dr. McKinney would agree with this, that, right, the abolition movement, the early 20th century attempts to build up Black communities and the response of, you know, terrorist violence in various cities. The civil rights movement is just a piece along the way. The internationalism of people like Bill Sutherland that connected the civil rights movement and the South African apartheid movement to the anti-colonial struggles in Africa. All of these movements have had successes. We've obviously eliminated many explicit legal systems that needed to be eliminated. We've given voice to people. We have powerful Black professors and Black politicians and things like that in this country who are able to be heard to some extent. And all of this goes right up to the movement for Black lives, right? Which is, you know, hasn't transformed policing in our country, but it's made the issue of policing in our country visible, right? Virtually everyone in America now can see videos and graphic footage of the abuse of citizens by police. It's worth emphasizing here that police violence in the United States is unprecedented for comparable countries in the world. If you compare even the rate of that white people are murdered by police in the United States, it's between 5 and 10 times, or in some cases 100 times what you see in Europe. And then blacks are murdered 7 or 8 times more often than whites are. So, but that's suddenly visible. That's not new. That's been what policing was about for as long as there's been policing in this country. But suddenly all these issues are coming to the fore. People are able to talk about things like whether it would be better to send social workers to a case of mental health problems than police. People are beginning to think about alternatives to prisons, which, you know, even 20 years ago was a small, tiny, isolated group of us reading Angela Davis and talking to each other. Now it's suddenly part of mainstream public discourse, and even the president is taking some small steps around private prisons. So, you know, I think the biggest successes, honestly, of the last, say, 20 or 30 years have been around pushing issues into a forum where the speech matters, where the issues are being considered, and the building of a movement, right? I mean, there have been millions of people in this country and tens of millions more around the world participate in active protest around white supremacy in the last year. That's extraordinary. That's you know, that's breathtaking in some ways that many people do that. You know, so yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of struggles. You can't legally own a black person in this country. Wow, that's a big damn thing. We can be on a panel together. We can sit together in a church or you know, as recently as 50 years ago, that wasn't true. Blacks and whites couldn't marry one another in this country. In my lifetime, right? I know people whose house was burned down because they were an interracial couple in the United States. I mean, think about that. This is not distant history. This is people I know. So we've made changes, but heavens, the struggle's ongoing, and the biggest things we need to count on is the number of comrades we've found in this struggle, and the connections that we've made between communities and across communities to build our power.
So even though we've understood how far we need to go, there is at least a conversation that has started, which is one of the biggest successes of this movement. I mean, the fact that we're having this panel, you know, we're in 3 different countries, we have different cultures, different ideologies, and yet we're talking about this issue and we're celebrating the legacy of someone who has played an important role in the progression of the global rights movement. And we understand and acknowledge how far we still have to go. But then there is still this sense of, you know, you can just for a minute sit back and realize that something somewhere worked. Iman, would you like to talk a little about the global implications of the civil rights movement in the United States and perhaps the impact that it had on the rest of the world?
Absolutely. I think what you see with the civil rights movement is the power that has been given to the human voice and the human body, and the power of amplification is that you've realized that conversations that were started because of the civil rights movement, or at least were amplified by the civil rights movement, no longer exist in a silo. It's now conversations among small groups of people. They spilled outside of the country into the international context, which is incredibly important. And that as a youth, what I see as a youth movement is that they've realized the power of education. And if they're not going to be offered this information in mainstream education, they will force themselves to learn it on their own. And I think that's what's interesting to me about the power of the youth themselves, is that they're not scared to say what they need to say. I know many times I've sat in circles where I've been like, that was a very courageous thing to put out there, because a lot of these times, especially with the environmental justice, with environmental justice, with racial justice, with discriminatory policies or behaviors, you realize that the youth realize that this is their future they're fighting for, is that they are the ones who will ensure that the movement does not end. And it is they're securing essentially for them the safety and comfort of their future, which they believe is not a privilege but a fundamental human right. And in that, it's also allowed for the beginning of conversations, and I think the primary building block of society, essentially in the family unit. You see that, especially in the Arab world, where it's often very difficult to have discussions about colorism or interracial or even interfaith marriages, where it's still very difficult to have those discussions and to say what needs to be said about them. Uh, and you know, though it's okay for people to have different opinions, of course, but to not even allow an open space for that conversation. I think what we've seen with the civil rights movement and really with any movement that encourages the freedom of speech is that it's dismantling the walls and the barriers that exist, of course, as a society, but especially within the family unit, and then eventually spilling outside of the household. And realizing the power given to the Black voice and the power given to all non-white voices as well, that sort of no longer exist as a subaltern. They no longer exist as the individuals in a community who will never be allowed to speak, who will never be allowed to be given a voice and can finally essentially relay their stories for themselves. But this also reminds me of another issue that we've recognized coming to sort of that we see now exists on the surface level, is what Dr. Abdul Karim mentions in an article that she names the twin truths of representation, is the danger of accepting tokenization. And I will use a recent example. This is more religious than it is racial, but Halima Aden, the first hijabi supermodel, and how she had to step back from the modeling realm because she felt that she was being forced to compromise. But she'd accepted tokenization so far as to allow for that compromise to exist. And so often that's what we fear with communities that are oppressed or face oppressive behaviors, especially with the Black community, is that you can be given platforms, but these platforms may not necessarily provide you with the power that you need, because you'll simply be tokenized, put on a pedestal, put there for everyone to watch you and to exhibit you and to observe you in awe. But really, what social change is coming of it? But I don't want to say that to allow sort of the degradation of the importance of these individuals in the places that they've been, but for us to recognize that we cannot simply allow them to exist as a symbol. I'll also mention a recent piece of literature that I read, Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle, and how people will only want, society essentially will only want a symbol, not this thing that is signified. They will only want an individual that they can put on a pedestal, but not an individual that can truly affect social change or to change the status quo in any way. But what I realize in the social scale is that we're starting to move towards that social change. We're starting to move away from allowing the pedestal to exist and bringing everyone to the same equitable footing where those conversations can exist essentially to change that status quo.
Thank you so much, Iman. So I think this is a call for our rights movement to move beyond tokenism, to move beyond looking at a cause and narrowing it down to one person and thinking that they provide the solution for it, or that they are the poster child for that particular movement or that particular evolution. I think it's important to recognize from what all of our panelists said today that there is a lot that we've accomplished, but then there is a lot that we still need to accomplish in terms of actually making these movements a part of our society, a part of our culture, a part of our progression and of evolution. Because there is a lot more to social justice, civil rights, Martin Luther King, than just celebrating the past. It's about looking forward. It's about dismantling the systemic oppression or the systemic stereotypes that people and places of power have in one way or another imposed upon us and imposed upon the society in general. So thank you to our panelists for coming here, for taking time out of their schedule. Before we end, we'd like to hear from our audience. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, now's the time for you to engage with us, to give us your perspectives, to ask us your questions. Ms. Cecile from the US Embassy will be forwarding these questions to us. So Ms. Cecile, do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Khansa. Thank you so much, Professors and Iman. Yeah, so there is a question that, in fact, Dr. Mark addressed in the chat box. So the question is addressed to all our panelists. The question is, it's a broad question. What 2 to 3 things would you say to use expat community that enjoy white privilege and feel removed from the Black Lives Matter?
Dr. McKinney, would you like to go first?
Sure, that's a great question from Nat Nag, who notes that they are a Rhodes College alum living in Qatar. So that's a beautiful thing. Go Lynx. It's a great question. And one of the things that I would suggest is sometimes being an ally, right, entails silence, right? Sometimes being an ally entails engaging in what many instances can be sort of the countercultural notion of sitting and listening and learning, but also understanding that this is going to be an uncomfortable process, right? So, you know, and this is a great question. There's going to be a lot of stuff that comes up, right? You know, for white allies when it comes to, you know, interfacing with and interacting with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And one of the things, you know, and we see this stateside, right? One of the things that, you know, my students really have to, my students really grapple with, my white students, is, you know, there's not going to be a situation where you're going to be running the show, quite frankly, right? You know, there's not going to be a situation where, you know, at no point in time are you going to become the chairman of this particular group, right? You might have some, you know, you might have some really serious and thoughtful input to make into this, but by and large, right, you know, when it comes to this particular organization, you can be an ally and you can be supportive, right? But part of that support is understanding that the people running this thing, right, are the folks who need the space to create and craft and articulate the trajectories of the movement, right? One of the best things I can do to be an ally to the people that I know who are fighting patriarchy, right? To the women, the people who identify themselves as women who are fighting patriarchy, is to sit in the room and listen, right? Is to sit in the room and listen. And then if I want to help fight patriarchy, the most effective thing I can do is not just to figure out my interactions with women, but I need to go and do some work with the brothers, right? I need to go do some work with the men. So again, this is one of the things that King and others on the cutting edge of the freedom struggle in the 1960s said. Stokely Carmichael used to say all the time, what we really need white allies to do is go talk to white people, right? We need white allies, right? You know, Black people are not the primary proponents of white supremacy. Spoiler alert, that's not us. We ain't doing that. That's y'all, right? So another crucial part of the work, right? Whether you are an expat living in the Middle East, or whether you are right here smack dab in the middle of the country, right? Is if you really want to be down for the struggle, right? Sure, you've got to figure out how to interface with Black Lives Matter, right? Everyone's got to figure out how to interface with organizations in ways in which, you know, are productive, right? But part of that work, a really hard part of that work, is knowing and understanding what role you can play in your house, right? In your community, in your religious community, in your family, right? In your neighborhood, right? To address the issues that that Black Lives Matter as an organization and other organizations fighting for racial justice and equality are trying to confront. You don't need to figure out how to interact with me to fight white supremacy. You need to figure out, white folks, you need to figure out how to interact with other white folks so you all can have conversations about how to dismantle white supremacy. I am always suspicious when, you know, church groups or any other organizations, right, want to bring me in to talk about white supremacy. Now, I'm a historian, right? So, you know, I'm happy to give anybody and everybody, right? The historical context, so that they have a framework by which to understand this stuff, right? But then when they say, if they say to me, well, you know, can you continue to work with us about it? And I'm like, no, I can't do that. Y'all got to figure that out, right? You know what your investments and commitments are. You know what your obligations are. You know how you feel about Black people, right? You know how you felt when your son or daughter came home with a Black person. You know that you haven't said a mumbling word about the district attorney who was clearly racist, right? Who clearly takes pleasure in locking up Black people, and you voted for them. You know you voted for them. Why did you vote for them, right? You know you are complicit in the maintenance and the defense of the systems and structures explicitly constructed to perpetuate white supremacy, right? You know this. So that's your work, is to figure out your role is to figure out what small thing you can do, right? To name that reality, and then help you and folks in your community figure out how you can go about confronting that reality. That's the single best thing I think that white allies can do when it comes to, right, relating to Black Lives Matter and other organizations dedicated to racial justice work.
So it's really about doing more than just talk about how we want to be allies. It's about playing our part by getting involved in these movements, by talking to people from our communities about these causes, and making sure that we tackle these biases from where they originate. So, Dr. McLance, would you like to add anything to this question or this discussion?
I'll just give an example because Dr. McKinney said what needs to be said about this. So recently, a coalition of groups, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Truth Telling Project, and others, came out with a call for what they call grassroots reparations. And this is a sort of simple 3-step process. It says, start with any organization you're a part of, your church, your school, your activist organization, your business. And you first take an inventory. How has your position in society, that your collective position in society, benefited from the history and structures of white supremacy? Secondly, you assess what tools you might have to offer toward changing that, right? Maybe a church has empty space 2 nights a week that could be offered to Black-led organizations. Maybe an activist group could volunteer for other people's struggles part of the time. Maybe a business could donate money. Who knows what it is? You figure that out. And third, you take the leadership of those organizations and give them what they ask for, not what you think they need, what they ask for, right? If you say, well, we got this space, and they say, well, you know what we'd really like is childcare, then give them childcare, right? So you know, that's just an example in a way that, you know, following up on what Dr. McKinney said, that, you know, the issues like racism or economic injustice, you know, or misogyny or whatever any of these issues, they impact every group that you're a part of. And every group that you're a part of are the ones that you can go back to and do this kind of hard work of taking an inventory and then committing to something, just committing to whatever it is that you could do for, yeah, there you go. That's all I got to say.
Thank you for sharing. So it's about becoming allies, listening to those who we want to be allies for. Iman, would you like to add anything to it before we just take one last question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would like to talk about, you know, it's like the way I'm taking these questions is almost like it's America against the world, or America, and then I'll talk about the international context. But I would like to just clarify that, you know, this is solely based on the few geographical areas where I've been, but in sort of the minimal activism I've been able to do, and I hope to do more with the communities that I work with, is that what's been most effective is usually sort of a four key steps is what I'll say. I like lists, so let's use a list. The first one is to learn your history and to unlearn your biases. The second is to contextualize the struggle. The third is to build the stage, and the fourth is to pass the mic. And what I mean by that, with regard to the first two, is to make sure that you're learning about what exists. Of course, learn about the struggles that exist internationally, learn about BLM, and learn about the movements that exist outside of BLM that are also fighting for racial justice and fighting against white supremacy. But at the same time, learn about your own context and understand that racism, misogyny, patriarchy, all of these issues exist locally as well. They just exist locally in different terms. I'll use an example. When I was in the Philippines, it wouldn't have made sense to take or transpose the Black Lives Matter movement into the Filipino context, because yes, racism does exist, but you realize that that's not necessarily, it doesn't exist in the same light. When instead these energies could be put towards ensuring equality for the Moro Muslims in Mindanao, who are constantly under attack by the Philippine government, but also realizing that the Black Lives Matter is not antithetical to the rest of the struggles that exist, to the rest of the movements, is that you can have Black Lives Matter movement existing alongside, whatever it is that you may be fighting for. If it may be for the rights of Muslims, or fighting against Islamophobia, or against misogyny, or whatever it may be, internationally. And I also like to add is to use, if you realize and recognize that you have privilege, which many of us would be able to, I will say from a personal standpoint, if you are part of the expat community, usually you are living most likely beyond your needs. You are definitely in a position of privilege, or at least perhaps I'm generalizing, but it's to use that privilege that you recognize that you have to uplift the communities. Instead of, you don't have to necessarily struggle yourself to be empathetic. And you don't have to allow quietism to take over simply because you think you're an ally and that's the best you can do. It's to teach yourself and to stop depending on the people to educate you. As a final point, I'll say that the frustration of many Black activists, which we found I felt was very pertinent, or at least I became more conscious of it, especially last year, was that these Black activists were not frustrated. It was not Black rage. It was justified anger over being forced to become unpaid tutors, because they were being approached by communities saying, please educate us, come speak for free at this event. We want to learn more. Well, first off, allow them monetary compensation. Again, you're living beyond your means, you're capable of doing so. And also recognize you have the resources within your reach to educate yourself before approaching others and asking them to do this favor for you. So I think there's a lot that we can do, and there's a lot that we have to learn as a community outside of the US to see what we can do for any social justice issue that exists.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you in the way that activism and activists are approached. And I think there's a lot that we need to do to take activism more seriously, beyond just a hobby and beyond just something we do to make ourselves look good. Ms. Asil, let's just take the last question before we finish.
Yeah, so there is a question which says, what would you say about the significance of learning about Dr. King's legacy here in Doha? And what can we do as non-Black people to help besides social media activism? And sorry, although this is seems the last question, but we have one of our participants here through Zoom who raised his hand. So Jackson, please feel free to share your question through Q&A. Yes, go ahead.
Iman?
Yeah, sure. I think it's much of what I've already mentioned is saying that learn about your own context, learn about the struggles that exist in the society that you live in, but also educating yourself and using the lessons that have been learned from movements like the Black Lives Matter movement and others similar to it, and fighting the racial and social injustices that exist locally. And also learning that if you exist in a position of privilege, is to accept that you can most certainly uplift the communities around you, who may not necessarily have the same privilege that you have or have the same platform that you have. I'll use an example. For example, the immigrant community, the local migrant workers in throughout the MENA region, that's a community that deserves your voice and that deserves your help, and you can often contribute to them. But at the same time, their racial issues do exist. So how can you fight racial injustice? You don't have to be. I will say you don't have to be selective with your activism. In fact, when we're selective with our activism, that's when we allow a sense of quietism to overtake us. when we stop being as effective as possible. And also, as is mentioned in the question with regards to social media activism, that's great. You're being informed, you're informing others, but don't let that stop there. Don't decide that that's all that you need to do in order to be effective or in order to fight the cause. If you're going to do anything, at least start those conversations at the dinner table. At least start with your family unit and allow it to spill outside of that community, and to learn how you can fight these other social injustices that exist as well.
And if I could jump in really quickly, I would suggest. I mean, that's a great way to start. Iman, you really nailed it. You really nailed it down. The other thing that I noticed with a lot of my students is their journey to activism often proceeds in sort of their academic community, their academic bubble, right? It starts off maybe as a class project or something fraternities and sororities are doing or something like that, right? So it's a group of people who are in my case here in Memphis, it's a group of people who are fundamentally disconnected from larger communities in the city, determining sort of on their own without any sort of acceptable amount of data how they want to be activists, right? How they want to perform, how they want to do the work of, we'll say, the work of racial justice, right? And this is a crucial part of the work, right? Is going out and acquiring the information so you can figure out, right, in a much more productive and intentional way, how you can actually impact and affect, how you can move us forward in this particular regard. A real quick story from a friend of mine who was an activist. She did a lot of work around homelessness, right? And this was about 15, 20 years ago. There's a national conference on homelessness in Chicago. And it's October, November, it's really cold. And a bunch of the activists, right, are unhoused. So they are in the park, right? And they've made a fire, so there's a bunch of people sitting around a fire and they don't know each other. So they're introducing each other. And so you get to this one person and she says, "Hello, my name is Mary. And, just full disclosure, I am from a really wealthy family. I'm going to get a large inheritance in a little while. And I'm just here to be an ally. And I just want to know, y'all just kind of tell me what, I just want to be an ally. So, what can I do to help us?" And the person next to Mary says, "You can get us some hotel rooms." Right? They were like, "Do you think we want to be outside in Chicago in November?" Right? And you're over there with like a platinum Amex card. "Mary, get us some hotel rooms. Mary, get us some damn lunch." Right? So it was like, "Yo, Mary, that's what you can do. We don't need you to be on a committee, right? We don't need you to help run the organization right now. Mary, we need you to put on your thinking cap, right? And get us out of the Chicago winter. Use your money. That's what we need from you right now. That's how you can help build this relationship, is help get us some shelter over the course of the next 3 days." Right? So and so again, one of the best things that we can do, right, is humble ourselves as we go out and look around, look out at the world around us, the world of our neighborhood, the world of our communities, and figure out how we can plug in by asking the question, right, with humility and intentionality. So yes, sometimes the answer is go to the soup kitchen. Other times the answer might be, for folks from privilege, is to write a check. Right? Is to write the check. I don't need you to go and create, and we could tell this to the superstars and the other folks, real famous people. No, I don't need you. We don't need another foundation, right? There's a bunch of people out here already doing really great work. They need a check, right? So again, connecting with the communities you say you want to be in community with, humbling yourself and being open to the multiplicity of answers that may come back at you in terms of how you can move to help the struggle along.
Thank you so much. Dr. Martins, would you like to add anything to it?
Sure. Look, the question was specifically about Doha. So we started today talking about how King always saw the essential interconnectedness of violence, of racism, and of economic exploitation. And he repeatedly emphasized that legal desegregation would accomplish very little if people were kept in poverty and economic dependence upon others. It doesn't require an enormous imagination to see that there are some issues of economic dependence in Qatar, that there are masses of workers who are legally and financially dependent upon another class of people. There are people organizing in that community. So I'm going to just throw that out. That might be a place to start your listening and to think about issues if that's the context that you're working in. And I hope it was okay to say that.
Okay, thank you so much for helping contextualize the issue, not just globally, but also in Doha. I mean, like any other community, there is a lot that we need to do here as well. And perhaps our problems are a little different, but there's, it's important to acknowledge how far we need to go and how far we've come already. We do acknowledge that there is great work being done here on education and on alleviating poverty and all of those, but there is a certain cross-section of society which is being neglected and which needs to be more included, perhaps. Thank you so much to all our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for our wonderful audience who was engaged, who was listening, who was asking questions. And thank you to the US Embassy in Doha for giving us a platform to discuss this very important issue. See you next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Khansa. Thank you, Professors Iman. And thank you to our participants today and everyone who watched us on Facebook. Thank you and hope to see you and work with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.